Okay, I think we are good. So, as I said, we're going to be going through and talking about all of... I'm just going to make a vid covering all essential literary fundamentals, and it's going to get a little abstract, but it should all make sense in the end. And then after these are all done, then I can, go back to making more just like immediately actionable, helpful videos. However, this first one, I actually, because jumping into the sort of purely extremely like technical stuff can be a little bit too like just much, a little too like abstract. It can take a little bit to see why everything matters. I figured I'm gonna make sort of like an episode 0 to this where where's my like an episode 0 to this where I essentially talk about a higher overview, and I also talk about what is I remembered recently is probably one of the most helpful sort of like heuristic approaches to like plot building I've ever seen. So I'm going to talk about it now. All right, so in other words, just think of this as a rough overview. You don't have to get everything, but it'll be a cool thing to go back to after we go through all the fundamental videos. So, at its core, just to remind it, everything in storytelling comes back to development of a theme. Let's put that in caps. Development of a theme. So what that means is that stories are not fundamentally different from essays. It's the same way, like when you write an essay, you need your thesis and all that crap. The difference is that storytelling uses completely different tools. Essays exist to explain things that can be explained purely in the realm of logic and presentation, whereas stories reach into a higher type of explanation that is unique to the power of actually creating a virtualization of events, which obviously essays do not do. So this is a very interesting thing that a lot of people are not aware of. Every themes cannot state ideas. Now that might sound contradictory, like I thought the whole point of a theme is to develop an idea. What does it mean to create information if you're not actually stating any ideas? That's what I mean. That's why the keyword is it cannot state ideas. It can only develop, and I'm going to actually put that in bold because that's extremely important to understand the difference between develop and state. So a stated idea is an idea that can be expressed in words and represents a flat logical perspective, but it also represents the limitation of logic and also the bias of words, because all words are spoken from a point of bias. No, don't do that. I.e. perspective. So what that means is it is actually impossible. It doesn't matter how logical what you're saying sounds. It is impossible to state something that is not coming from a place of bias. And this is just an absolute truth that just storytellings just work with. Don't worry about why this is true. This just is true. It's just like, for no matter how logical an idea may seem, no matter how absolute an idea may seem, you can just form a perspective in which it's not true. In other words, like, no, don't do that. Literature is the embrace of the subjective. So essentially it's like, because to just give you an example, like if you have some, like, if someone says like 2 + 2 equals, this is like the most classic, like, comical example. It's like people say 2 + 2 = 4, and then you'll get like these like really, really like low IQ people like coping about how like, I don't know, math is racist or something, and they'll be like, no, it can, if you change your perspective, 2 + 2 can equals 5. Obviously, that's not what I'm talking about, because essentially what that is that's a framework of logic in which it's being used for a specific tool that produces a specific result. If you want to get that result, you have to work within the proper framework of mathematical logic. However, the idea of higher ideas about life, which is what development of ideas is, that's the difference between statement and development. Development is higher than human existence, i.e. logic. Because human existence is like a logical one. You exist and you strive for survival and all that shit. The actual objective part of you that exists is bound to rules of nature and logic and blah, 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 all that shit. But the part of your mind operates... Oh, no, sorry, not mind. Mind/identity. Just get rid of mind. Identity operates on bias, subjectivity. So the part of you that actually experiences the world is not bound to logic. And the part that experiences the world is the, actual, that's like the de facto world for a human being. So while it might be objectively true that 2 + 2 = 4, as far as your actual experience in the world, to put it as crude, to use as crude an example as possible, 2 + 2 might just subjectively not actually equal 4 for a person, in the sense that doesn't actually capture the for lack of a better word, the actual feeling of the experience of being a specific person. So anyway, that's just a really, really, don't worry too much about this. This is just a really complex way of me saying that ideas develop by comparing and contrasting various biases. So what that means... No, that should not be... No, that's fine. I'm going to put this in bold. So in other words, the truth comes out not in the objective human existence, i.e. logic. The higher truth comes out when you take these identity-based, this identity-based info, i.e. the subjective, and you compare different subjective views to each other. This is why I've said that. I think I said this in another clinic. Foils are. This is why foils are so effective. You got your Guts and your Griffith, your Lelouch and your Suzaku. They're so effective because they're two characters that fundamentally, to their core, have conflicting biases. What life is to one is just fundamentally opposed in a very satisfying way to the way it is for the other, but they also see certain things extremely similarly as well, so which makes their differences more significant feeling. It's why can those two things be, why can those subjective truths be the same for them, but those other subjective truths are different? So this is just a really rough overview of this concept, and we're going to get into this in really full detail. But the reason I wanted to go over this just really roughly right now is because I wanted to talk about the best heuristic. This is the best heuristic solution to developing a plot I've ever seen. I didn't come up with it. Someone brought it to my attention. It was some Japanese guys crash course in plotting stories. And so basically he said, when in doubt, make make characters suffer. So, or let's just say, i.e., make things worse. So why is this such a good heuristic for plot, for coming up with plot? Basically, the thing about a theme, and this is why I went through the trouble of explaining this shit. The thing about a theme is that all themes consist of thesis, but also what I simply just call the antithesis. It's literally just the reverse. So in a well-developed story, you cannot state an actual, again, developed idea. Okay, I shouldn't say the word state because I just said you can't state. You cannot develop an idea effectively without developing its opposite. And that's extremely crucial to understand. You must develop the opposite of an idea to develop an idea. So what that means is, like, just for the most generic way to put this is, like, if you're going to make a story about how good life is, you want to explore all the good in life, like, let's develop that idea. How can life be so good? You cannot do that without also talking about how bad life can be. It literally, for now, you'll see more in the future why this is so true, but you just literally cannot do it, because any idea that is material for a theme is going to be some kind of statement about the world and existence and stuff, and thus it goes back to a point of bias. All you have to do to prove a bias wrong is switch to a different bias, and this is why this is the essence of literature. It's comparing biases. Thus, the ultimate thesis you chose is ultimately nothing more than the product of multiple biases, and when multiple biases come together, they contradict each other. Thus, an antithesis always emerges. It always emerges. You cannot. If it doesn't emerge, it means you didn't write a good story. So, it just means you didn't actually develop your thesis. So, back to why, when in doubt, you can just make characters suffer. Not literally. I'm going to tell you some of the pitfalls of this, but why is this a good heuristic? Because the essence of development is conflict. And obviously everyone knows this. This is what they teach in school, that conflict is the heart of all plot and development. They teach it very literally, in terms of, like, there literally is a conflict, or there's no story, which is, as anyone who's seen, like, true slice of life works know, that's actually not true, but for now we'll just accept that. We'll just talk within a genre framework for now. Conflict is significant because it produces questions. Conflict produces questions. And what kind of questions are they? These are perspective-based questions. They're biases. They're questions that correspond to someone's biases. So in other words, in a literary context, all questions default to a point. Let's just say default to bias. all questions default to bias. So what this means is that this is actually a really interesting property of stories, and this is why I say stories have access to things that essays don't. If you're writing an essay and you want to develop the idea of like, does 2 + 2 = 4, and you really want to develop that idea, you're going to get into the ideas of math. You can only deal within the realm of logical questions and answers in an essay, but stories have like a magic power where they actually do not care inherently about objective logical ideas. And even when an objective logical idea is introduced, it by default, if you properly set up a story, meaning you properly establish there are characters and there are event flows here, in other words, all the things that make a story, all questions of any kind will actually default to some kind of deeper subjective implication. So if a story starts bringing up the idea, does 2 + 2 really equal 4? That's not actually asking the question, does 2 + 2 = 4? That's a retarded question. It's asking something fundamental. It's asking, like, what does 2 + 2 = 4 mean to, like, this perspective? Like, from experiencing the bias of the characters involved, is 2 + 2 = 4 like really meaningful? Is it not so meaningful? Is it like de facto wrong, etc.? It's asking those questions. It's asking the nature of bias. This is why ideas that can seem extremely philosophically shallow can actually produce some of the best kind of conflict things. For example, it's pretty outdated now because it's been done to death, and it's been done extremely well in certain cases. But the question of like the value of a human life and like, is it okay to kill? Is it okay to kill in certain contexts? Is a very, very shallow question. I personally find that extremely shallow. However, it works very well in certain literary contexts because it's something, even though it's extremely shallow from like a point of logic, when you put it in a point of bias, it becomes extremely complex and deep. Everyone has a very different relationship with it, meaning it's something that's very complex to develop. So, back to why character suffering can be so effective. It's because basically conflict produces consequence. Let's do a new one. All consequences must stem from the nature of something. Okay, so a good conflict produces consequences. A consequence is a change that is effectively an irreversible change. So, like, I shoot you in the head and you die. That's a consequence. It's the consequence of the gun. It's the consequence of me deciding to use the gun. It might be the consequence of my feelings towards you, like maybe I hate you, whatever. It doesn't matter. Point is that it produces a consequence. And in a storytelling environment, all consequences elaborate the nature of something. When something becomes an established consequence, it proves established. I'm going to put established in bold, and you'll see why in a sec. Established consequence. I'm also going to put proves in bold. Proves the nature of something. So, what I mean by that is conflict comes in 3 stages. Conflict has 3 stages. Suggested, active, resolved. Wait, I want to get my music back. Resolved is the state proved. This is the point where it becomes proved. This is effectively foreshadowing. I'm just gonna put sort of, because it's not foreshadowing, but it's, you know, it's kind of active is, I'm just gonna say, like, meat of plot. So basically, whenever there's a conflict, it comes in these 3 stages, obviously. And the first stage is where, like, a thing might be a problem. You don't actually know if it's a problem yet. So, for example, if you have a villain, okay, but he hasn't actually done anything bad yet, it's just like, oh, this guy, like, might be an issue. We don't even know how strong he is. We just know that he's, like, of a bad nature. He might do some bad shit. He might be able to, he might not. We don't know. There's a lot of questions. He's not actually an active conflict yet. And that's really important to establish. He becomes an active conflict when he is actively trying to force a consequence. He is trying to make something bad happen. Like, he is actually actively working towards creating something irreversible damage or irreversible suffering, or suffering with an irreversible consequence to it. When he actually does do something with an irreversible consequence, he actually, you know, permanently damages something or changes something, that's when it gets proven that it gets proven that his conflict actually was real. So there's an interesting idea that if you present something, if you present an idea, a conflict, but you remove that conflict without causing any actual, like, permanent bad effects, it's actually the same as if it never happened at all. Which is really the nature of what makes this heuristic so good, because nothing is proved. If a villain shows up and he's a problem and he's actively threatening characters, and let's say he even kills some tertiary characters, okay? But then the protagonist manages to kill him. Let's say he even kills a secondary character, but the protagonist kills him, saves the day, everything's fine, and the protagonist is not meaningfully affected by the death of even the characters who die. Effectively, nothing happened. There was no point to that. And this is what I call sort of like the sort of like battle syndrome, sort of like battle manga syndrome and stuff like that, because a lot of people making stuff like Battleworks, because Battleworks is often kind of considered like sort of like the lowest brow thing, and it's considered the lowest brow thing for a reason, even though it has some actual extremely high level instances in it, you know, such as like Hunter x Hunter. It has such a bad rap for a reason, because it's often not actually used for storytelling purposes, but rather for cope purposes. And that's because people actually like... Can I do a strike through? I actually don't know how to do a strike through, so I'm just gonna delete this. People actually like removing this portion. They like removing the actual resolution of conflicts, the establishment, the proof of the nature of it. Because questions and answers about life, because they always come with a thesis and antithesis, they're often painful. They're often hard to deal with, and they often suggest that you have responsibilities as a person if you want to live the type of life that you actually want to live. But that's why they're so good, because they're essentially a textbook for living. Good stories like tell you everything you need to know to live effectively, at least within the realm of the ideas they cover. But with that comes responsibility, and people don't like that. It's a lot easier to just be like, well, what if I didn't have to deal with the nature of things? What if I didn't have to deal with the consequences of things? And what if Goku could just beat up the bad guys before anything actually becomes an issue? That's one of the unfortunate properties of stories, and it's one of the reasons why bad storytelling can actually have demand, because it's removing the harsher nature of things, and it's creating a cope that's actually very comfortable for people, certain types of people, people who want cope. So that is why when it comes to solving the battle syndrome, for example, you can literally just use this heuristic. It's like, oh, you want like a battle thing to be good and effective? Well, then just, create like a pick your poison situation out of like beating the villain. Like, you've already just made it better. You've already made it so that like it's gonna be more interesting. Like, okay, you can kill this villain and save the day, but let's go for something mad cliche. Like, you have to ultimately become a tyrant at the end to do this. You have to become a monster. It's just that you've already made it so much better than, the dude shows up and nothing was like actually, a proven issue. Because again, like, classic people did get this, like the people way back in the day, like the old, even with their very, very more primitive stories, the guys who knew what they were doing, even back in like the old Greek times, they did get this, and that's why they would often, right from the start, they would kind of state explicitly this sort of simplistic nature of something that's causing a consequence. Like Oedipus, for example, I'm pretty sure they explicitly state like, oh yeah, this guy was so driven by hubris. They'd like say that a lot, like, oh man, this dude was so arrogant, he didn't notice he was killing his own dad and sexing his own mom. He didn't even notice. He was too self-absorbed. They're crudely stating the nature of something that established and proved consequences. Romeo and Juliet, for example. This is more sophisticated because this is in Shakespeare's time, but compared to modern otaku storytelling, it's very simple. But it's like, oh, the star-crossed lovers, they're so obsessed with each other. They're so obsessed with each other that I actually can't remember who does it. I think Romeo kills himself prematurely. Yeah. Romeo kills himself when he sees Juliet in a pseudo-dead state. He jumped the gun because he's so obsessed, and it makes that really clear. Oh, that's the nature. He's so obsessed. This is how like extreme, passionate, youthful love works. It's brash, blah blah blah. It's a very crude explanation. It's a very crude description of the nature, but it's effective. It's still true, and no matter how actually, when you get to really, really sophisticated and complex stories, it never leaves that. It never will leave that idea that like, oh, it's the nature of things that establish and create consequences. And no matter what idea about life you develop, it must come with like an opposite perspective. So it's like, to put something like Romeo and Juliet as simple as possible, it's like, oh, they were meant for each other, and they made life so meaningful to each other. But at the same time, they also, take life away from each other. And if one goes, it removes the meaning of life. It's a very crude and simple, but tried and true, thing that you'll never escape from, even in the most complex stories. So now we're going to get into the real, this is just a really, really broad overview. We're going to get into the real meat of shit from here. And shit's going to get very, very technical, a little bit abstract, but I'm going to explain fucking everything, and I will explain it with no ambiguity. You'll have absolutely everything. So look forward to that. So this is like episode 0. You don't actually need to get anything too tangible out of this, other than I just wanted to make it clear how good this heuristic is, and why you should think about it if you haven't thought about it.